I noticed in your bio that you are promoting the separation of church and state, and that leads me to think more broadly that you probably find something very seriously at stake here, maybe culturally or socially, even politically. If we have confusions, or if we muddle these things, or we treat one thing as another thing, then that could have really real implications. And I noticed the same in your book, that you find there to be cultural implications of not calling things by the right names or not understanding what's really going on. So I'll ask each of you to speak to that a little bit. What's at stake here? What do we risk if we misunderstand or misclassify these kinds of knowledge? And I'll ask you first,
Okay.
Dr. Rinzler.
Well, I think the most important thing for me that's at stake here is not so much the cultural and social effects, although those are obviously certainly important because we see that play out in society. You can see it in the presidential election that's coming up, and those are obviously crucial things for many, many people. But for me, my own personal approach to this is that I'm interested in people critically thinking and thinking well, and maybe that's obvious because I'm teaching at a university, and that's the whole point of the university, to think clearly and to think well and understand how to do that. So for me, these types of discussions are absolutely critical because I think, as Ian referenced, I mean, these address some of the most fundamental questions that a person can ask of themselves. So it's very important that we think clearly about these things.
Good. And I'll ask the same to you. What do you think is at stake in these kinds of distinctions?
You know, there's a great deal at stake one way or another. I'm not quite sure how I should address this other than to sort of respond to the critical thinking thing. I mean, I'm 100% in favor of critical thinking. How could one not be? Okay. But the question is, what is critical thinking? I mean, critical thinking is more than, you know, question everything or reject authority. So I see critical thinking as being a way of trying to assess the truthfulness while recognizing and hopefully discounting and avoiding the influence of both pure assumptions and personal or corporate interests, okay? So it's a way of thinking in such a way that you try your best to avoid those kinds of influence. And I think that when we're thinking about questions of science and religion, it's very hard for us to avoid those kinds of influences. So I think in general people's religious positions are very often influenced by many, many more things than simply a critical assessment of, you know, history or whatever else evidence you might bring to bear. I think there are many reasons why people believe, and there are many reasons why people don't believe, and this is one of the most difficult areas in which we can wrestle with these things. But it's often, you know, Christians are often, or religious believers in general, are often portrayed as being sorts of people who are bound up and have been carried away by wishful thinking. This is what Freud thought religion was about. He thought, you know, basically we all have this wish to have a gracious, benevolent father figure in heaven who's going to look after us, and that's where, you know, religion comes from. That's approximately what Freud thought about religion. You know, I'm sure there is wishful thinking in many cases, but wishful thinking exists on both sides. So, I mean, I think it's often the case that people don't believe in God because they actually don't want a father figure, or they don't want someone to whom they'll be responsible for. They prefer to live their own life unencumbered by those kinds of trammels. So these kinds of background thoughts are present in all of those things. And to my way of thinking, critical thinking is about trying to set those aside and examine the evidence as unbiased as we can.
So, if I may, so Ian, one thing I don't understand is, I think as you defined faith, it is a crucial linchpin. It's a crucial thing to bridge a gap in there. And the thing I don't understand is, it seems like at that exact point, critical thinking is gone.
No, I don't agree with that. So that's a good question, though.
Okay.
I think faith, first of all, what is faith? Faith has sort of three main strands of meaning. One is belief, often belief without proof in a proposition or a system of propositions. Faith is also trust or confidence in a person or a thing. And often faith also means loyalty to a person or a principle. Okay? And I think all three of those meanings of faith are important and active in Christian belief and in Christian faith. Actually, the emphasis is on the second too. The emphasis is on confidence, and the emphasis is on loyalty. Okay, but it's not the case that we simply are setting aside the first meaning. I mean, actually, it's not the case that the Christianity is sort of believing 6 impossible things before breakfast. It's not, I believe, that Christians are called, to believe in the teeth of the evidence. On the contrary, I think that Christian faith and Christians generally are called to an intelligent belief. So I gave you in my lead-off the way I, if you like, try to balance that thinking by recognizing that in our lives we have partial knowledge all the time, and we're obliged to make decisions based on partial, incomplete knowledge all the time. And if we're to be successful in life, we have to do so in a decisive way. And I think that my faith as a Christian is, I don't know all the answers about Christianity. I have looked at it and to the best of my ability understood the conceptual aspects of it and the personal aspects of it. And I've reached the point of saying, yes, I believe this, and I'm going to act on that in what I take to be a consistent way. I haven't proved it, and that's the part which is belief without proof, okay? But I would assert that everybody is acting on belief without proof all the time throughout their lives. And so that kind of action is not unique to religious, religious exercise.
Okay, well, let me respond by making a distinction between the pragmatics of having to make a decision in real life and what is valid epistemologically if we're talking about what's the right path to knowledge. So if you're talking about just how do we get to knowledge, then it's exactly that gap where you don't have sufficient knowledge that you have to warn yourself against just making the conclusion. It would be much more honest, I think, to say, I don't know. I'm up to this point. I can't bridge that gap. I don't have enough evidence. There's not sufficient evidence to get me over that gap. So therefore, I don't know. But I need to make a pragmatic choice, so I'm going to do that. That would be a more honest approach to that, rather than to claim, yeah, but I do know, or that is knowledge there. Because
but Paul, how much is enough proof? That's the heart of the question, okay? I mean, there are many things which we call knowledge which we don't have proof of. Is it true to say, that Miles Davis was a genius jazz, trumpeter? I think he was, okay? And I would say there is knowledge involved in that assertion, but I couldn't offer you a proof of it, okay?
Well, you could take a rigorous critical thinking approach to that question if you introduced clarity into that question, because oftentimes the problem is that the question doesn't gain clarity. I would say, well, what do you mean by genius? And if we can narrow that down, if we can say genius is this and this and this, then we might have some clarity. Can I offer you?
Yeah, we might have some clarity, but I suspect we would have this uneasy feeling that we'd actually boiled this down so much that we no longer were talking about what we were originally talking about. In other words, that I think genius, musical genius in this particular case, is something that's extremely hard to measure in the way that the natural sciences expect to do so. And that's why I use that
Well,
example. Okay.
except that's only if you leave genius as a vague concept. If you actually say, you have to more or less define it arbitrarily. I mean, of course, there's a definition in the dictionary, but for your purposes, you might have to make some arbitrary decisions, but that's fine. Given that definition of genius, you can tie that. Let me give you an example that just happened to me. My new favorite song is Loan Me a Dime, recorded by Boz Scaggs with Duane Allman on guitar back in the 70s. And it's a great blues tune. The first lyric is, "Someone loan me a dime, I gotta call my old time used to be," which is just a great blues lyric, and it's a great bluesy song. But the song changes, it builds up slowly and slowly until the end. My description of it, kind of similar in my analogy here to the word genius, is it's triumphant, because it takes that horrible blues situation and gains control over it, which is one of the great things that the blues does. So I think that's triumphant. Now, I would never claim that I know that it's triumphant. That's merely my interpretation. While at the same time, I can give you an objective definition of what is triumphant. You're going to be playing loud, you're going to be playing a lot of stuff, the tempo is going to be increased, that's how they build up the tune. So I think it's crucial to always keep clear what really is knowledge and not let us get into knowledge where we really haven't gotten, like, triumphant or genius if it's left vague. If you actually define what it is, then you can say, if that's what triumphant means, if that's what genius means, then this is triumphant, that isn't, et cetera, or that's genius and that isn't.